Hi, I'm Jay Allen Sanford from the San Diego Reader. Thanks for joining me to talk about another episode of the 1950s television anthology, Tales of Tomorrow. I've written for magazines like Cult Movies, Starlog, FilmFax, and Midnight Marquee, and the Reader published my in-depth history of this program a while back. This 13th episode of Tales of Tomorrow, Sneak Attack, was broadcast live as it was performed on an ABC network soundstage on December 7th, 1951 at 9:30 p.m. The date's particularly notable because Sneak Attack was broadcast on the 10th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The story, set in the far-flung future of 1960, which was about 9 years in the future ahead of when this aired, somewhat accurately predicts 21st century warfare with airplanes that are weaponized to become bombs, which of course is reminiscent of 9/11. And it also predicts drone warfare in that it's got armed drones that are disguised as regular U.S. planes that are showing up all over America. And one of them explodes a nuclear bomb, or rather what they call, I think, a heterodyne bomb. And it's part of an invasion attempt. And remember that in 1951, when this episode aired, we're talking about less than 10 years since the end of World War II. So our story kicks off here with a captured American pilot, and the announcer says he's on, quote, a hospital on foreign soil, unquote, after being shot while trying to cross a border. The enemy is never really specified beyond what they say there. I think at one point they refer to them as just enemies of liberty, is about as specific as they get. But it's clearly meant to be a Russian-style communist enemy. And of course, by 1951, the Russians had supplanted the Japanese as America's favorite boogeyman and looming threat, and certainly the most popular source of propaganda at the time, which is certainly what this episode qualifies as. It is a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of anti-communist chatter all through it. And of course, remember at the time our military was battling communism in the Korean War, and that included meddling from America's communist rival as well. And the Russians were backing over there. They had USSR fighter planes involved in that. So, by extension, this is sort of addressing that was happening at the same time. And this was also, of course, the era of McCarthyism, where communists were the boogeymen around every corner and hiding behind every door. So our American here in the hospital he's a pilot. He may or may not be a spy. We kind of find out. He's recovering from having been shot trying to cross the border, I believe they say. He's played by Zachery Scott. And he was a real sort of a movie star at one point. The role he plays here, he's a wise guy, which he was real good at. His character here spends a lot of time making like lame dad jokes. The interrogator here, when the interrogator asks him, "What are you looking for?" Our wise guy here says, "Well, what are you hiding?" So that's touche, Mr. Bond. We got Zachery Scott was a fairly big deal movie star in the 40s anyways. He starred in as the lovable cat in The Mask of Demetrius, and he landed juicy roles in films like Mildred Pierce, The Southerner, Danger Signal. You can see him in Flamingo Road starring Joan Crawford. But as his Hollywood career kind of somewhat faded, he began doing a lot of TV anthologies beginning around 1950. He did all the shows like Armstrong Circle Playhouse, Studio One, Pulitzer Prize Playhouse. And he did a string of them like Chevron Theater, Schlitz Playhouse, Campbell's Suspense Soundstage, Chevy Mystery Show, DuPont Show of the Month, Revlon Mirror Theater. Man, they sure named a lot of anthologies after their sponsors back then. But he appeared in a couple of 1953 episodes of a show that we reference frequently in these commentaries, a show called Suspense. That was a thriller anthology. It's a little similar to this in a lot of ways and did share a lot of creators and performers. And the writers of Suspense also included Rod Serling, did an episode of that. And Zachery Scott also turns up in a couple of 1955 episodes of a few TV shows that are also similar to this, like Science Fiction Theater is one. He plays a doctor in 2 episodes of that. Actually, he plays one in, the first one is called The Lost Heartbeat, about a doctor who wants a fellow doctor basically to implant an experimental artificial heart in his chest to replace his failing ticker. And of course, in 1955, that was the stuff of science fiction. The first permanent artificial heart wasn't successfully transplanted until 1982. And the other episode of science fiction theater that Zachery Scott played a doctor in, particularly notable, it's called Beyond Return. And it not only adapts a story that was also done on Tales of Tomorrow, but the Tales of Tomorrow version was once singled out for praise by Rod Serling himself. He cited the Tales of Tomorrow version as one of the inspirations when he was dreaming up the Twilight Zone. Both the science fiction theater version and the Tales of Tomorrow version, they based their episodes on a story called The Adaptive Ultimate, originally written by Stanley Weinbaum. And he was one of the original 12 Science Fiction League of America writers who pooled their work to form the database that helped launch Tales of Tomorrow. Zachery Scott also turns up in a 1960 episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, episode called The 548. And that's actually directed by a vet of both Twilight Zone and Boris Karloff's thriller, a fellow named John Brahm. And that's the episode about the ex-wife who she forces her husband at gunpoint to listen to her increasingly nutty rant. And Scott sometimes found himself in the newspaper headlines for things other than his acting career. He was arrested in 1951 for drinking in Louisiana in a bar that was favored by black patrons, which at that time violated segregation laws. In court, his defense was that he was invited into the bar by black men in U.S. military uniforms, and said, of course, he was proud to share a drink with American soldiers. Then 10 years later, in summer 1961, he was arrested in Hawaii for public intoxication. He was reportedly so drunk that time that when the cops were trying to arrest him, he kept on trying to do a hula dance outside the bar. They had trouble getting the handcuffs on him. So our beautiful hospital doctor here is played by Barbara Joyce. And she at first thinks the American is someone from her own communist government, someone probably sent to spy on her and the other doctors, because she has sympathies towards the West here, she's making clear. And she, of course, falls for our American pilot. She's even willing to pretend his awful dad jokes are funny. And she ends up agreeing to help him battle the tyranny and oppression, which is her own government. Because luckily, this whole bombs on a plane invasion thing that I mentioned is it's actually based right out of this very hospital. And it's never clear how the American pilot managed to get shot and taken to the exact hospital where, for some reason, a hospital is the source of exploding planes. But this, if we haven't said so yet, this really isn't the greatest Tales of Tomorrow story. But it is, again, prescient in the way that it did predict a lot of 21st century things. The foreign doctor is played by Barbara Joyce, as I mentioned, and she'd returned to Tales of Tomorrow the following year, in 1962, to do 2 more episodes. She appeared in Memento, and she was also in one called The Horn. She was a regular on a lot of the TV anthologies, including the genre programs that were similar to this, like The Web. She featured her in 2 episodes, in 1951 and again in 1954. She was actually still working in 1972 when she appeared as a regular on the Ken Berry Wow Show. And that was a comedy variety show hosted by the former F Troop honcho, Ken Berry. And it featured other regulars such as Steve Martin, Terry Garr, and none other than Charlie's future angel, Cheryl Ladd. The original story that we're working from tonight, the teleplay was essentially, it's a futuristic secret agent spy thriller, I guess we could classify it as. It was based on an idea that was provided to the producers of the program by an actual military vet who had some knowledge about how American planes were being prepared for such an eventuality that we were thinking about creating this kind of drone warfare ourselves at the time. And story idea came from the founder of the USAF's Squadron Officer School. His name was Richard V. Ritchie, and you'll see his credit at the end of the program. They do mention him. And he did reportedly also, according to TV Guide anyways, he donated the author's fee that they paid him for that idea to a fund for the Pearl Harbor survivors and for the family members of the military personnel that were killed in the attack. So it does all, again, stem from the commemoration of the 10-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor. So in the story, these unmanned remote-controlled planes, they land at 25 big city airports in the U.S., and they threaten to detonate their payloads unless the President of the United States gives up control of the nation to the enemy. The planes are somehow impenetrable without making them explode, which I think is what happens in Denver. I think that's the city they blow up. And they say something like 46,000 people are instantly killed. So the president, his decision is to either let 24 more cities kind of go up in flames or surrender the entire country to the enemy, unless we can all be saved by our covert agent that we saw there. Or is he just a pilot? We're not really sure. Who's already in enemy territory, laid up in that hospital recovering from gunshot wounds. The president, I think, ends up deciding that he'd rather let countless Americans get blown up than kneel down before the enemy. So our story has a lot of elements of spy thrillers already, which is a genre that the show delved into several times. They weren't shy about that at all. There's so much political intrigue in the episode like Many Happy Returns that it brings to mind movies like The Space Children. Both movies are about an alien presence that brainwashes kids to use as military pawns right on military bases. Parents get screwed over in both of those, in fact, there's a gadget in the Tales of Tomorrow version that literally electrocutes the nosy dad, who pries into the kid's mysterious inventions. Not sure how the machine manages to electrocute dad minus the power source, but I guess that's part of the mystery. But yeah, there's more spy games and episodes like Age of Peril, that was in 1952. That was based on a story called Crisis 1999. And by Frederick Brown wrote that, actually. He did the story that another episode of Tales of Tomorrow was based on called The Last Man on Earth. So the doctor here that we're looking at, he actually approves of their love affair so much to watch this. He's actually going to turn out the light here and kind of let them start making out. He's a little too willing to let his fellow doctor make out with this potentially foreign spy. But I guess that is their way of showing us that his sympathies also are with this lovable American spy that makes terrible dad jokes. And he's played by a fellow named Theo Getz, the doctor there. He got his start on TV in 1951 on that Suspense series that we mentioned so often. That was one of his earliest TV roles. He actually appeared on 3 other episodes of Tales of Tomorrow, and they were all the following year after this, 1952. You can spot him in an episode called Ahead of His Time. He's also in The Golden Ingot, and he's in The Diamond Lens. And he's probably best known as Papa Bauer on that mid-1950s version of the Guiding Light soap opera. In case you didn't know, there was a 1950s version of the Guiding Light. So, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the people behind the scenes here. I'll tell you about our writer, Mel Goldberg. He actually had started his writing for early TV anthologies like The Trap, 1950. And, that same year, he adapted an Agatha Christie story, Three Blind Mice, for that show, The Trap. And that episode starred the future star of One Step Beyond, John Newland. In 1952, Mel Goldberg also adapted Ray Bradbury's story, The Rocket, for a TV special. So he had a lot of experience with science fiction. He wrote for later TV shows like Hang 'em High, The Big Valley, Hawaii Five-0. He also wrote for TV anthologies like Climax, Kraft Theater, General Electric Theater, as well as Studio One, where he frequently worked with the future co-producer of Boris Karloff's Thriller, a fellow named Fletcher Markle. In 1960, Mel Goldberg wrote an episode of Boris Karloff's Thriller. Although I think Fletcher Markle had departed the series at that time. Episode called Worse Than Murder, which was about a woman that uses a diary for blackmail. Mel wrote 8 episodes of Tales of Tomorrow. He also wrote Test Flight, which also accurately predicts the 21st century events in the real world. That one's got billionaires are the ones who actually finance space flights because they're more equipped than governments to do so. He adapted a story for Tales of Tomorrow called What You Need that was later adapted much more successfully for Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. He also adapted a famous Raymond F. Jones story called The Children's Room for the series. And he scripted the episodes Bound Together, Enemy Unknown, The Search for the Flying Saucer that we mentioned. And he adapted an H.G. Wells story for Tales of Tomorrow called The Crystal Egg, which starred Oscar winner Thomas Mitchell. Around 6 months after this episode of Tales of Tomorrow, he did a really interesting episode of the TV anthology Suspense. Comes up almost every commentary, featuring, it was actually based on a story by William P. McGivern, who later wrote a bunch of episodes of the Christian Twilight Zone series. That's what they call it anyways. It's a show called Insight. And that episode of Suspense is called The Crooked Frame. It's about a successful female cartoonist whose comic strip Sally Forth, which unrelated to the real Sally Forth strip from the 1980s, is about to retire, and one of her staffers is suspected of her murder. Really interesting story with a female cartoonist that runs her own studio. So we're going to tell you some of these actors. We're looking at the U.S. General, is played by Royal Beale, and he around the same time as this show aired in 1951 was on an episode of The Hands of Mystery, a similar show to this. That was an episode called The Smiling Buddha. He also appeared on the mystery anthology The Web in 1951 and 1954. He did dozens of other TV anthologies and weekly programs and TV series. This fellow here is talking as he's the President of the United States. He's played by Richard W. Shankland. He appeared in a couple of episodes of the anthology Hands of Mystery. Another one of those kind of creepy ones. They're not unlike what we're watching. It was around the same time as this. He did episodes of that in 1951 and 1952. He did a handful of other 50s anthologies and TV shows. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the Secretary of Defense, but I'll tell you real quickly, he was played by John Seymour, who was on Lights Out way back in 1949, as well as appearing on Hands of Mystery in 1950 and 1951. He also did a lot of the TV anthologies, as well as turning up on a few episodes of The Honeymooners, of all things. So, get back a little bit here to Mel Goldberg there. He has a very interesting story. You could say that he liked his femme fatales. I mean, he wrote a 1950 episode of the occasionally creepy TV show Sure as Fate, an episode called Tremolo. That's about a young husband whose family is experiencing strange events after it appears that his wife and maybe his mom, too, are going insane. So there you have two potentially evil and destructive ladies. And according to IMDb, Tremolo was directed by none other than future Westworld star Yul Brynner. Mel Goldberg also adapted a story for Suspense called Set Up for Death, where, of course, the setup in the title involves a woman tipping off the police about a robbery that's probably going to get her ex-con boyfriend, well, set up for death. So Mel Goldberg also scripted one of television's very first depictions of juvenile delinquents, and that's worth mentioning, too. A 1951 episode of the Crime Syndicate TV series. An episode called Juvenile Drug Addicts. And Crime Syndicate was a very topical series, and Mel Goldberg also wrote episodes of the same show with titles like Illegal Immigrants, Syndicate Accountant, and one called Fight Fix, because Goldberg liked both topical and historical subjects. He also scripted several episodes of You Are There, which was sort of an early reality series, sort of docudrama. He wrote episodes for that about historical events like the first Moscow Purge trial, the rise of Genghis Khan, and the sacrifice of Mahatma Gandhi. Those are all 3 episode titles from You Are There. He also wrote the Lou Gehrig story for a 1956 episode of the TV anthology Climax. So Mel Goldberg continued writing and adapting stories in this early sort of reality TV docudrama vein by teaming up with a couple of his Tales of Tomorrow collaborators. He teamed up again with Don Medford, who did a lot of Tales of Tomorrows. In 1953, they got together to do this Untouchables-style TV show called Treasury Men of Action. And they did an episode together called The Case of the Old and Frightened. And then Mel Goldberg and Don Medford teamed up again in 1955 for an episode of the General Electric Theater. That's the one that was hosted by Ronald Reagan. And for that one, Mel Goldberg adapted a story called The Return of Gentleman Jim for an episode that starred movie star George Montgomery. Goldberg also reunited with a Tales of Tomorrow vet named Leonard Valenta for a 1954 episode of the mystery anthology The Mask. That episode was called Poison Village. And Goldberg also adapted a Philip McDonald story called Fingers of Fear for the Mask series. He was really good at this sort of thing, this sort of suspense thriller anthology. In his later years, if you remember that 1974 anthology, The Evil Touch, scripted one of those episodes. He scripted the Death by Dreaming episode. Mel Goldberg retired a few years after writing a 1978 episode of The $6 Million Man called The Lost Island. And you can actually find out more about him online. He's a fascinating fellow. We don't have much online about our director, though. His name was Leslie Gorall. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Gorall. His early television career included directing TV shows for WDSU in New Orleans. Then he got this job here at ABC in New York City, where shows like this were filmed. From 51 to 52, among the ABC shows he worked on, around the same time as this was his only episode of Tales of Tomorrow, but he also did a variety show called The Arthur Murray Party, and that show went on the air at one time or another on all three commercial networks between 1950 and I think 1960. Leslie Gorall also did TV directing work for a 1951-1952 TV series called The Carmel Myers Show. Directed dozens of episodes of that. And it was a 15-minute variety show that was hosted by the former silent film star and early Hollywood vamp Carmel Myers. Some of the guests on that show included Flash Gordon star Buster Crabbe and Flash Gordon cartoonist Alex Raymond. Plus they also had Richard Rogers and Oscar Hammerstein, and Rudy Valley, Jeanette MacDonald, Johnny Mercer, and Dorothy Fields. You probably heard of several of the films that Leslie Gorall worked on as an assistant director, although it was often uncredited, including horror movies like Mr. Sardonicus in 1961, and science fiction films like 1962's Panic in the Year Zero, the 1966 comedy The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, and the 1969 Elvis Presley Western Charo. So we're wrapping things up here. The president's pretty cocky here because even though he only accidentally got out of this, by his pilot landing there, he announces that America will never buckle under to the enemy, and acting like it was all him that did it, even though just by sheer happenstance. And this time, Tales of Tomorrow didn't blow up the world yet again. So thanks for joining me. I always enjoy doing these commentaries, and on this one you can actually flip over. There's a second commentary by one of the producers of the program, Mort Abrahams, and you can toggle back and forth from that actually while you watch the program and watch him sort of addressing some of the things that we're seeing on the screen. And hope you enjoy the next episode, and thanks again for joining us.